The first time I said what I actually thought, I was standing at the kitchen sink with my hands in dishwater up to my wrists, and Jonas was sitting at the table behind me, and I said it so quietly, I almost hoped he hadn't heard. But he had. I know he had because the sound in the room changed. Not loud, not angry, just different, the way air changes before a storm that doesn't come. He pushed back his chair. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door, and he walked out to the barn without a word. I stood there with my hands still in the cooling water, and I thought, that wasn't so bad. I thought, maybe this is going to be fine. I was wrong. What happened next didn't happen loudly. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way Amish punishment always happens, slowly, quietly, and from every direction at the same time, until the day you wake up and realize that the entire world you were born into has shifted 1 degree away from you, and you are standing in it like a woman who no longer quite belongs to anything. Before we go any further, there's something I want to say from the heart. More than 90% of the people watching right now haven't subscribed yet. And perhaps that wouldn't matter so much if these stories were just words. But they're not. They're pieces of a life. Pieces of a silence that lasted years. Pieces of women who were never supposed to speak out loud. So if you found something of yourself in this video, please take a moment to subscribe. It's completely free, and it helps this community keep growing. And while you're here, I want to know something. Tell me in the comments, have you ever said something true and then spent days wishing you could take it back? Let me know below. My name is Martha, and this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where the things that were never supposed to leave the kitchen finally get said out loud. I grew up Old Order Amish in Geauga County, Ohio. I married at 19, I left at 26. And in the 7 years between those two facts, I learned something about what happens to an Amish woman who speaks her mind that I have never heard anyone explain correctly from the outside. So I am going to explain it from the inside. And I need you to stay with me, because the part that will surprise you is not the part you're expecting. When people outside our community imagine what an Amish husband does when his wife says something he doesn't want to hear, they imagine something loud. They imagine shouting, maybe a hand raised, maybe a door slammed hard enough to shake the frame. I understand why they imagine that. It makes a kind of sense that fits the world they know. But that is not what happens. What happens is quieter than anything most people have ever experienced. And in some ways, it is worse, precisely because of how quiet it is. There is no moment you can point to. There is no bruise. There is no raised voice you can describe to anyone later. There is only the slow, careful withdrawal of warmth. And the thing about warmth is that when it leaves a house gradually, you almost convince yourself it was never there to begin with. The morning after I spoke my mind at the kitchen sink, Jonas came in from the barn for breakfast, the same as always. He sat in the same chair, he ate the same way, eggs, bread, coffee, no conversation, because we did not tend toward conversation at breakfast. Nothing was different. And yet, everything was different, in a way I could feel but could not name. The way you can feel a door is locked before you ever put your hand on the knob. He thanked me for the meal. That was the first sign. Jonas did not usually thank me for meals. Thanking me for the meal, said in that particular flat voice, was not gratitude. It was distance, measured out and placed carefully on the table between us, like a plate that was not meant for me. Now I need to tell you what I had said that started all of this, because I think you need to understand how small it was. We were talking about his brother Daniel, and whether Daniel's family would be coming for the harvest. Jonas had already said they would come on the Thursday. I said, gently, That I thought Wednesday would work better because of the canning I still had to finish. That was it. That was the whole of what I said. I thought Wednesday would work better. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not say that Jonas was wrong. I said that a different day might suit our household better. And I said it in the voice of a woman who had learned to sand every hard edge off a sentence before she let it out of her mouth. And still, because here is what an outsider doesn't understand about speaking your mind inside an old order Amish marriage. It is not the content of the thought that matters. It is the fact of it. It is the fact that you had a thought separate from your husband's thought, and that you let it become words, and that those words moved through the air of his house and landed somewhere he had not invited them to land. The theology of it goes back to the same verse that governs everything in our community. A wife submits, a husband leads. But submission in our world is not only about actions, it is about the direction of thought itself. A wife who suggests a different day is not just suggesting a different day. She is demonstrating that she has been thinking independently. And independent thinking in a wife is the first crack in the wall that the whole community has an interest in repairing. By the third day of the particular quiet that followed my sentence about Wednesday, I had started to wonder if I was imagining it. That is the other thing no one tells you. The silence is designed to make you doubt yourself. Jonas was not unkind. He helped the children with their boots in the morning. He fixed the latch on the cellar door that had been loose for a month. He was present and functional in every way that a husband is supposed to be present and functional. He simply was not there for me. Not in the small, invisible ways that make a house feel like somewhere you belong. No eyes meeting mine across the table. No hand resting briefly on my shoulder as he passed. No moment at the end of the day when the gap between two people closes just a little before sleep. None of that. Just the pleasant surface of a marriage with all of the inside scooped out. On the fifth day, his mother came. Now, I want you to understand something about an Amish mother-in-law arriving at your house on the fifth day after a disagreement. She did not say she was coming because of the disagreement. She said she was coming because she had extra preserves and she thought I might want them. She sat at my kitchen table and she looked around my kitchen the way women in our community look at things. Not quickly, not obviously, but slowly, taking small inventory of everything. The cleanliness of the floor, the order of the shelves, the state of the children, whether the windows had been washed recently. She was measuring, not meanly, just the way a woman measures who has spent 50 years understanding that the condition of a kitchen tells you everything about the condition of a marriage. She talked about the weather, she talked about Daniel's family and the harvest, she talked about a woman in the next district whose youngest child had been ill. She never once mentioned Wednesday. She never once mentioned the thing that had passed between Jonas and me at the kitchen sink. She didn't need to. The visit itself was the message. She had come to look, and I had been found, I would learn later, to be managing adequately, which was the closest thing to approval I would get. I want to pause here and tell you something that I spent years not understanding. What was happening to me in those days was not cruelty. I need you to hold that. Jonas was not a cruel man. His mother was not a cruel woman. The system they were operating inside had been built over generations for reasons that made a particular kind of sense to the people inside it. A community where every family depends on every other family cannot afford the instability that comes from wives and husbands who argue openly, from homes where the hierarchy shifts, from women who feel entitled to redirect the decisions of their households. The system requires order. The system requires that certain things stay in their places. And the way the system maintains that order is not through force. It is through belonging, through warmth, through the knowledge carried in the body of every Amish woman from the time she is old enough to understand that if you step outside the lines, the warmth will go. And the warmth is everything. The warmth is your mother and your sisters and the women at church who have known you since you were born. The warmth is your place in the world. And the system is very, very good at making you feel the edges of that warmth the moment you begin to move toward the edge. By the end of the second week, I had stopped thinking about Wednesday. I had stopped thinking about canning schedules and harvest logistics and whether Jonas's brother would come on Thursday or Wednesday or any other day of the week. I was thinking only about the quality of the silence in my house and what I needed to do to change it. That is the mechanism. That is the thing Lydia would later explain to me in different words behind the bread table at a barn raising. That the silence is not an accident. The silence is a teacher. And it teaches one lesson and one lesson only. That the cost of a separate thought spoken out loud in this house, in this community, in this life is higher than you are willing to pay. I changed. Not all at once, not dramatically. I changed the way a field changes after a hard frost. Not destroyed, still there, still the same shape, but different underneath in ways that wouldn't show until spring. I stopped offering alternate days. I stopped saying, I was thinking. I stopped the small, careful sentences that began with, what if, or I wonder whether. I did not make these changes consciously. I made them the way a woman makes any change that keeps her warm. Gradually, without ceremony, without anyone needing to ask. And here's the part that took me years of sitting in a therapist's office to understand. I told myself at the time that I was choosing this. I told myself that I had weighed the situation and decided that peace was worth more than being right about the harvest schedule. I told myself that this was wisdom, that this was maturity, that a good wife chooses her battles, and I had simply chosen not to fight this one. My therapist listened to me say this, and then she said something I have thought about almost every day since. She said, a choice made under the threat of losing everything you love is not a free choice. It is a surrender that has been dressed in the language of wisdom, so that the woman surrendering can survive the surrender. I did not have words for that inside the community. Inside the community, there was only one word for what I was doing, and that word was becoming a good wife. I stayed for 4 more years after the kitchen sink conversation. I had another child. I learned to read Jonas the way I read the almanac, not for pleasure, but for information. I learned which moods meant the day would be navigable and which meant I would need to be very careful and very quiet and very small. I became, in the language of everyone around me, a woman who had settled well into her marriage. And the women in my community meant that as a compliment. And I took it as a compliment. And somewhere inside the part of me that remembered standing at the kitchen sink with my hands in the dishwater, thinking that maybe this is going to be fine. Something very small and very quiet began to understand that fine was not what I had signed up for when I was 19 and standing in my father's barn with 300 people and 7 kinds of pie and my whole life just beginning. I left when my youngest was 3. The story of leaving belongs to a different video because it is long and it is complicated and it has parts in it that I am still not sure I can say out loud without my hands shaking. But I will tell you this. The thing that made leaving possible was not courage, not in the beginning. The thing that made it possible was language. Sitting in a small office in a town I had only been to twice before, talking to a woman who had a notepad and a box of tissues on her desk, and who looked at me like I was someone worth listening to. And she began to give me words for things I had only ever felt. Coercive control, isolation as a tool of compliance, the weaponization of belonging, consent that is not consent because the alternative has been made unthinkable. I sat in that office and I heard those words for the first time, and I felt something I can only describe as the room getting larger. Not because the words made what happened to me worse, but because they made it real. They made it a thing that existed outside my own head, a thing that had a name, a thing that other people had identified and studied and written down, which meant that other people had lived through it and survived it, and were somewhere on the other side of it living lives that did not require them to sand every thought down before it became a sentence. I want to be careful here because I have said this before and I will say it again. Jonas was not a monster. He was a man who had been given a script and had followed it the way he had been taught. The bishop who preached submission from the pulpit was not inventing cruelty. He was repeating a theology that had been handed to him the same way it had been handed to the man before him and the man before that. The mother-in-law with her preserves and her careful eyes was not my enemy. She was a woman who had once stood at her own kitchen sink and learned the same lesson I learned, and had long since made her peace with the cost of it. The system is not made of monsters. The system is made of people who have forgotten that there was ever another way to arrange things, or who remember and have decided that the warmth is worth more than the truth. If you grew up in a place where your thoughts were not your own, I see you. If you have ever carefully sanded a sentence down before you let it leave your mouth, I see you. If you have ever stood at a sink with your hands in cooling water and wondered whether the thing you just said was going to cost you everything, I see you. You were not too much. You were not wrong to think. You were living inside a system that had decided your thinking was a problem to be managed, and you managed yourself instead, because that was the only tool you were given. I still think about that moment at the kitchen sink sometimes. The cooling water, the changed air, the particular sound of Jonas's chair pushing back from the table. I think about the woman I was in that moment, standing there thinking, maybe this is going to be fine. And I feel something for her that is not quite pity and not quite pride, but something in between. A tenderness for a woman who didn't yet know what knowing would cost her, and who said the true thing anyway, even quietly, even carefully, even with all the edges sanded off. She said it. She let it move through the air of that kitchen. And somewhere in the long road from that sink to this seat, that sentence became the first stone on a path that led, eventually, out. If this story touched something in you, please tell me in the comments. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me if you have ever stood at your own sink, in your own kitchen, with your own hands in cooling water, and said the true thing anyway. And if you want to keep hearing the stories from behind the prayer cap, the ones that were never supposed to leave the kitchen, subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. There is so much more I still need to say. Before you go, I want to say this. More than 90% of the people who watch these videos still haven't subscribed. And every time I think about that, I think about all the women sitting quietly somewhere, listening, not yet sure if they're allowed to stay. You are allowed to stay. Subscribe. It's free, and it helps these words keep reaching the people who need them most. Until next time, remember this. You were never too loud. You were never too much. The room was just too small for everything you actually were.